On December 25th, people around the world came together to celebrate Christmas Day. They eagerly anticipated the delicious food, gift-giving, and Christmas movies. Grapevine, Texas, a suburban middle-class town covering 16 square miles and home to about 50,000 people, was no exception. The town takes great pride in its love for Christmas, even earning the title of the Christmas capital of Texas.
Before we continue, Christmas is almost here, and we've got something special for you. Imagine cozying up in the comfiest Christmas hoodies, designed to bring the magic of the holidays to life. Whether it's for you or the perfect gift for someone you love, our exclusive Christmas hoodies are here to make this season unforgettable. Don't wait. These one-of-a-kind designs are selling out fast. Visit uncoverizeshop.fourthwall.com now and grab yours before it's too late. And here's a little holiday treat. Use promo code CHRISTMAS to get 15% off your order. Let's make this Christmas the coziest one yet. Link is in the description.
Christmas Day, 2011, was peaceful and calm in Grapevine. Residents were enjoying time with their families, and everything seemed as it should. That was until 11:34 a.m., when a phone call interrupted the quiet. The caller was breathing heavily, and it was unclear what was being said or what the situation was. After roughly 20 seconds, the line went dead, and the caller was no longer responding. The call had come from the landline of a local apartment, so police and firefighters were quickly dispatched to investigate what, if anything, was going on. Just 3 minutes later, the police arrived at the 2-story unit of the Lincoln Vineyard Apartments, part of the 25-100 block on Hall Johnson Road. The apartment the call had come from was located at the back of the complex and overlooked the fields of Colleyville Heritage High School. Many people had left to spend time with families and loved ones, so loads of the apartments were empty. When they arrived at the apartment, the front door had been locked from the inside. They knocked on the door, but the silence was deafening. Nobody was answering or coming to the door. Officers looked through the window and came across a gruesome scene. There were 7 bodies, some on the sofa, some lying on the floor. Knowing that they could not waste any time, they kicked the door in and gained entry to the apartment. It was in the living room they found the bodies. There were 3 males, 2 adults and a teen, and 4 females, 2 older and 2 younger. They had all been shot to death. Some of them had defensive wounds, indicating that they had attempted to shield themselves from the bullets. It appeared that they had just finished opening their Christmas presents when the massacre took place. The 2 adult males each had a gun in their right hand. None of the neighbors reported hearing any gunshots, but there were not many people around in the apartments at that time. As the police found out across the complex and crime scene examinations got underway, one thing stood out. A sport utility vehicle was parked outside the apartment. After running checks, they found that it was registered to a man who lived 2 miles away in the suburb of Colleyville. News was quickly spreading about the Christmas Day massacre, but they needed to identify the victims before any information could be released, as well as inform the next of kin. The police thought they knew who the victims were, but they had to be sure. Getting confirmation would take longer than they wanted, as the state driver's license fingerprint database wasn't available due to it being the holidays. The bodies were removed from the house and taken away to have autopsies carried out. After this, the names of the victims were eventually released. They were all part of the same family. Sergeant Robert Eberling explained that there had been 2 weapons, one being a Glock 2340 caliber pistol with a 10-round clip, and the other being a Smith & Wesson 915 model 9mm pistol with a 15-round magazine. This was registered to the owner of the vehicle parked outside. The weapon had been purchased in 1996. The December 26th, the owner of a local spa became concerned when one of her employees of 4 years had failed to turn up for work. She tried calling her employee, but got no answer. For somebody who's always early to work and who never misses a day of work, we expected the worst, she said. Residents were terrified. This was the worst gun violence that the community had ever seen, and the police needed to deal with their fears. Sergeant Eberling said, "We are pretty confident that the shooter is among the deceased victims inside the apartment. We are not actively looking for a shooter that we believe is at large." As they began to piece together what they knew, the truth about who these people were and what had happened would eventually come out. Colleyville, Texas, a wealthy suburb of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, just a few miles away from Grapevine, home to the Yazdan Panah family. Parents, 56-year-old Aziz and 55-year-old Nazreen, had both been born in Iran. They married in 1987 and moved to the United States, where they later welcomed 2 children, Nona, who was 19, and her younger brother Ali. Nazreen had worked in a salon doing manicures and would often talk about her family with people. Family was everything to Nazreen. She was close to her sister, Zor, and together they were described as 2 of the nicest people you could meet. Zor was married to a man called Mohammed Hussein Zor, who was also known as Hussein, and he was very well known amongst the Iranian-American community. He owned a large ranch in Dallas, and the family was incredibly close. The Yazdan Panahs lived in a 3,000-square-foot property in Collaville, and on the surface, things appeared to be fine. Neighbors would see the family having yard sales, and Aziz appeared to be very active in his children's lives. He volunteered as a debate coach at Nona's high school. One neighbor said he was, from everything we saw, actively engaged with his children. He was described as outgoing and would say hello to people if he passed them in the streets. But neighbors did note that he seemed to be very protective of his children. Nona and Ali were both doing well, so their parents had plenty to be proud of. Nona graduated from Colleyville Heritage High School and was a student at a local community college. She had big dreams of moving to the West Coast and going to school in California with hopes of one day becoming a lawyer. One of Nona's friends said that she had implied all was not well within her family, and that things were becoming tougher for them, but she divulged no further information. Her friend said that she was aware that Aziz was, in her words, really strict with his children, and would take Nona's phone and refuse to give it back. She added that Nazreen was far more understanding than Aziz was. Nazreen's brother Ail said he had been supporting the family financially, as Aziz had not been in employment for a number of years, having previously worked in the mortgage and real estate business. His financial problems had been going on for years. In 1996, he was placed on probation for 3 years after he entered a plea of guilty to 1 count of subscribing to a false income tax return. He was issued with a fine of $1,000 and ordered to pay $30,119 in restitution to the Department of Justice. Just 3 years later, Aziz and Nazreen jointly filed for bankruptcy. The case was discharged a few months later. The financial problems continued to get worse. In August 2010, Nazreen had filed for bankruptcy. She told her lawyer that she hoped doing this would mean they would be able to keep and stay in their family home, but the house was foreclosed on. Aziz initially attended the meetings with Nazreen, but this would soon change. During the proceedings, she separated from her husband and moved with her 2 children out of the family home to an apartment in Grapevine 2 miles away. Nazreen's brother had paid for the apartment, as due to the house being foreclosed on, they were living without electricity or water. Nazreen was the only one bringing money into the house. Nona opened up to one of her friends and said she felt like her family was falling apart. The bankruptcy Nazreen had filed for was later dismissed as she had not made the planned payment according to her lawyer, George Barnes. He wrote in his notes that Nazreen had said to him, "Please don't talk to husband at all." Aziz had listed his employment as being self-employed, even though he was out of work and bringing no money in at all. Aziz allegedly sold the family's furniture and rugs to pay for sex workers. The separation and financial difficulties had been incredibly hard on Nazreen. She had a state cosmetology license, but disease had forbidden her from working. After he became unemployed and the family's finances took a hit, she had worked 2 jobs at different baths to try and keep the money coming in. After they separated, a family friend said that Nazreen had done everything she could to remain on good terms with Aziz. They said, with the help of her sister, she decided to just buy the basic things for her apartment. She was a very quiet, very super kind lady. She was a peacemaker. She didn't want anything to happen to her kids, her family. She was a really wonderful mom and always protecting her kids. After Nazreen moved out, Aziz stayed in the family home, and neighbors would often see him working in the yard. One neighbor said he wasn't even aware that Aziz's wife and children had left the home. Although separated, they did appear to be on good terms, and Aziz also had a key to the new apartment and would occasionally swing by to see his children. As the year began to come to a close, it was soon time for what the people of Grapevine loved most, Christmas. On Christmas Eve, the extended family had all gathered at Muhammad's ranch to enjoy a large Christmas party and spend some much-needed time together. One of those in attendance was 22-year-old Sarah, Zoreya Muhammad's daughter, who attended the University of Texas at Arlington as a pre-med student, and was also a member of the Tri Delta sorority. Dozens of people were there, and the celebrations carried on late into the night. Aziz had not been invited. The following day, Christmas, Nazreen and her children were at the apartment in Grapevine. That morning, Aziz had set off to the apartment in his sport utility vehicle, dressed as Santa Claus. He parked up outside. Shortly after he arrived, Nazreen's sister, brother-in-law, and niece came to the apartment too. Just before 11 a.m., Sarah sent a text message to her friend which said, "So we're here. We just got here, and my uncle is here too, dressed as Santa. Awesome." She was, of course, referring to Aziz. Just 15 minutes later, she sent another message. Now he wants to be all fatherly and win Father of the Year. Within a few minutes, after opening their gifts, Aziz revealed he had brought 2 guns with him. He opened fire and, in terrifyingly quick succession, killed 6 members of his family. Ali, Nona, Zor, and Sarah had multiple gunshot wounds and had been shot several times in the head. Muhammad had shots to his chest, stomach, and head. Nazreen had 1 shot to the head. At 11:34, less than 20 minutes after Sarah had sent that text message, the 911 call was made. Although what was said on the call was not clear to the dispatcher at the time, the police decided to run it through a different software to see if the audio could be enhanced, and if any more information about what had transpired could be found in the call. After doing this, it was determined that someone said, "Help, help," and then the caller said, "I am shooting people." They came to the conclusion that Aziz had made the call to emergency services. He had then attempted to stage the scene and point the finger at Muhammad. He put the Smith & Wesson into the right hand of his brother-in-law, trying to make it appear as though he was a shooter as well. Muhammad had 4 gunshot wounds to his body that had been fired from both the gun in his hand and the one Aziz was holding. This was not something he could have done himself. After wiping out his family and calling the police, Aziz turned the gun on himself. Mayor Tate Williams expressed his shock at what had happened, calling it a terrible tragedy, adding, "The fact it happened on Christmas makes it even more tragic." Sergeant Eberling, who had been working on the case, echoed these sentiments. "This is the worst homicide we've ever had. These have been the first murders in Grapevine since 2010. People could not believe that something this violent had happened on their doorstep. Funeral arrangements were made, and friends, family, and loved ones flew into Texas from across the country and abroad. The 6 victims were later buried in a private service." As police continued with their investigations, they went to the home in Colleyville that had been foreclosed on, hoping that they would be able to find more. They wondered if Aziz's computer would reveal some information or a possible motive, but it emerged that the electricity for the property had been turned off, so the computer had not been used. They remained stumped as to what could have possibly led to him committing such a violent attack. As they talked to friends and family, they began to piece together the picture of a man who was deeply unhappy that his wife appeared to be doing better without him, whilst he was unemployed and remained in the home he was about to lose. The bank was due to remove him from the house as early as March the following year, and the prospect of becoming homeless, coupled with his wife thriving and doing well, could have possibly been a motive. But, as he is no longer here to account for his actions, his exact thoughts will never be known. Lieutenant Todd Deering said, "You can speculate about his bankruptcy, you can speculate about his family relationships, you can speculate about a bunch of different things, but we just don't know right now. Everybody who may have known what the motive was, or what set everything off, is now deceased." Sergeant Eberling added, "We really don't have a clear idea of why he did this. Sometimes there's not a really good explanation for irrational behavior." One of the friends of the family said it was her belief that the murders had been motivated by Aziz's anger that his wife was doing good on her own. The shootings in Grapevine on Christmas Day not only stunned the community and shocked the police department in its senselessness and brutality, it left a family shattered. For Nona, Ali, and Sarah, their lives had only just begun. The possibilities and opportunities before them were limitless, and who knows what remarkable achievements they might have reached. For Zor and Muhammad, they were two individuals who meant so much to both their community and their family. The loss of their lives was immeasurable for those who loved them. As for Nazreen, who was finally beginning to thrive and embrace her new beginning, the fact that her life was taken by the man who had vowed to love and protect her only deepens the tragedy caused by this senseless act of violence. Matthew Kraft was originally from the small town of Washington, Connecticut. As a child, he was sweet and honest, qualities that continued into his teenage years as he grew into a dedicated and honorable young man. While in 10th grade at the Kent School, Matthew decided he wanted to join the Marines. After graduating from Kent, he attended the Citadel, a military college in South Carolina, where he graduated in 2016 and was commissioned as a Marine Corps officer. By February 2019, Matthew, at 24 years old, had achieved the rank of First Lieutenant. He was serving as a platoon leader with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines at 29 Palms, part of the 1st Marine Division based at Camp Pendleton in California. At the end of that month, he had 2 weeks of pre-deployment leave before his unit was scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan. Matthew planned to spend most of his leave on a 10-day hike along the High Sierra route, which runs parallel to the John Muir Trail and passes through both Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. He intended to begin the 195-mile trek on February 24th, starting in the Sierra Nevada mountains at Kearsarge Pass in the Inyo Forest and ending near Bridgeport in Mono County. He expected to complete the hike by March 4th or 5th, but packed enough supplies to last several extra days in case of delays. Matthew had submitted detailed plans for the hike to the Marines, who approved his plans for his leave. He had also shared these plans with his family, but they were more concerned about his safety, completing the challenging hike on his own. Matthew would be hiking at elevations between 9,012,000 feet, and most of the ground would be covered in a thick layer of snow. Matthew had previously hiked the route in the summer of 2018 as preparation for this trek, and was looking forward to accomplishing this even more challenging winter hike, which would require him to ski for much of his journey. He had made meticulous plans and brought the necessary equipment for such an intense trek through the backcountry. He was a very experienced hiker who had previously gone on a 2-week trek on the Cohoes Trail through New Hampshire and Canada and had hiked 40 peaks in the White Mountains. He had plans to hike the Appalachian Trail. Matthew also had extensive training with the Marines that helped prepare him for the difficult conditions he would be facing on his hike. He had twice gone through mountaineering training at the Marines Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport. In most of the physical tasks he was subjected to in the Marines, he was almost always the person to beat. Matthew spent his weekends and shorter leave periods on hikes in the mountains. While he enjoyed the outdoors, he had a higher purpose for spending so much time in difficult and remote areas. He believed that improving his survival skills and physical health made him a better Marine. This final intense hike before his deployment was his own personal final training activity before he left for Afghanistan. While Matthew had estimated that his hike would end on either the 4th or 5th, depending on the numerous variables that go into such an intensive endeavor, his family became concerned by the 4th. When Matthew's father, Greg, did not hear from him that day, he alerted the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. They searched around the various trailheads in the area where Matthew may have come out of the wilderness that night. They also looked at cell phone records, which showed that the last activity on Matthew's cell phone had been near Independence, California, close to where Matthew's hike was set to begin in Inyo County. Inyo County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue began their search of that area in the first several miles of Matthew's planned route the following day. On March 8th, around 9 p.m., they located Matthew's vehicle at a campground near Lower Grays Meadows, north of Independence. As far as authorities could ascertain, Matthew had begun his hike as planned but completed it and was still somewhere in either Sequoia or Kings Canyon National Park. 13 different agencies were a part of the extremely difficult search for Matthew. Marines from the Mountain Warfare Training Center, where Matthew previously trained, were a part of the military effort to find him. Over the next 10 days, an area the size of the state of Rhode Island would be searched. The terrain along Matthew's planned route was challenging enough under good conditions, and winter storms raged during several days of the search for him, making the effort even more difficult. On March 9th, approximately 2 miles into the route from the Kearsarge trailhead, a search team on foot found a massive recent avalanche debris field. Evidence of several smaller avalanches was also found in the area. Due to the potential risk to the teams on foot, the search shifted to become primarily aerial. On March 15th, low-flying aircraft using thermal imaging picked up a heat signature, and hopes were renewed that Matthew would be found alive. Unfortunately, the heat was found to be coming from a hibernating bear. Following this disappointment, the search was scaled back from an active search and entered a limited, continuous mode. While his remains have never been found, the Marines consider Matthew to be deceased. Given the timeline of events, severe weather, and increased avalanche activity in the search area, on-scene search and rescue experts have determined that craft was most likely overcome by severe weather and exposure. Captain Paul Gainey, a spokesperson for the 1st Marine Division, said in a statement made on April 11th, "The Marine Corps will continue to stand by and support Craft's family, friends, and Marines during this difficult time." The Marines list Matthew's date of death as March 15th, 2019, the last day of the active search. Matthew was posthumously promoted to the rank of captain. The backcountry Matthew had been hiking is generally only without a thick layer of snow on the ground in August-September. The Craft family was hopeful that during this 2-month window, new searches, under better circumstances, would lead to the discovery of Matthew's remains. Park rangers led 2 search teams to look for them. Because the terrain is so challenging, only highly experienced hikers can search the area where Matthew disappeared, meaning that there cannot be as robust of a volunteer search effort using members of the general public as there is in other cases. Flyers were distributed amongst the hikers traveling along the Sierra High route with information about Matthew and the specific type of gear he had taken with him for his hike, like his Katadyn water filtration system, Quick Point sleeping system, and Scarpa T1 ski boots, in hopes that should a hiker come across any of this equipment during their own hikes, they would know to report its location. Matthew's family has accepted the fact that he most likely died somewhere in the mountains. They have purchased a gravesite for him and ordered a headstone for it. They held a memorial service for him at the First Zone Congregational Church of Washington back in Connecticut in September of 2019. However, they still hope to locate Matthew's remains and lay him to rest. They hope this will provide more details about Matthew's final days. They also hope that the location where the remains are found will help narrow down the day Matthew died, which they believe will help with their mourning process. Without that, it's going to be 3 weeks of mourning every year, Matthew's father, Greg, said in 2020. It's 365 days of mourning now. An electric candle sits in the middle upstairs dormer window of the Craft family home. Every night, Matthew's father turns it on to symbolically light his son's way back home. Each time he turns it on, he says, "God bless Matt," and repeats that phrase every morning when he turns it off. 46-year-old Bradford Brooch was a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but lived with his wife and 3 daughters in Allen, Texas. He worked as an accounting manager at the Beck Group, an architecture and construction firm based in Dallas. In the summer of 2016, he took a trip to Alaska with one of his daughters and stayed at the Hotel Alyeska at the Alyeska Resort in Girdwood. However, his daughter returned to Texas before he did, and he remained in Alaska for a few extra days. On Tuesday, August 2nd, Bradford hiked up the North Face Trail near his hotel. He rode a tram back down after completing the hike up, disembarking it at 9:05 p.m. At 9:45, he signed the trail log at the trailhead for the Winter Creek Trail. While 9:45 p.m. sounds like a very late time to start a hike to most people, there was still plenty of daylight left for Bradford's hike. This part of Alaska has over 17 hours of daylight a day in August on average. There would have been enough light left for Bradford to hike safely for almost 2 more hours. Bradford briefly talked with another person at the trailhead before heading onto the trail for his hike. Bradford's family did not hear from him the following day. His wife reported him missing at 6:30 in the morning on Thursday, August 4th, when he failed to board his flight back home. Bradford's belongings were still in his hotel room, and his rental car was still parked in the resort's lot. He never signed out at the trailhead, and there was no other evidence that he had ever come back from his hike. According to the Alaska State Police, There was still a strong signal from Bradford's cell phone at 10:32, the night he disappeared. The cell phone signal placed him in the Winter Creek Trail system where he had gone for his hike. This was the last indication of him and his location. The Winter Creek Trail is a popular and well-maintained trail. It is wide and mostly flat. It does go through a heavily wooded area, so individuals who go off the trail have gotten lost in the woods before. But according to the Alaska State Police, they are generally located fairly quickly. The trail leads up to the edge of a narrow gorge, 100 feet up from Glacier Creek. A hand tram runs across it, allowing hikers to pull themselves over the creek to the other side in a metal basket. Once they reach the other side, they can get on to the Upper Winter Creek Trail, which is a more challenging hike. Bradford did not leave any notations about his plans when he signed the trail log, so it is unknown how far he planned to go on his hike that night. Bradford falling from the tram into the creek was an obvious initial concern during the search for him. In 2016, additional safety measures had been installed on the tram, although it is unclear if they were installed before Bradford went missing. Even with these extra features, however, there has been a fatal accident on this tram. In June of 2019, a 57-year-old man from Anchorage died after falling off the tram and missing the safety netting below. Since Bradford's body was not immediately located, if he had met with the same fate, he would have had to go into the water. The rushing creek was difficult to search, but a local resident did raft it looking for Bradford, and an aluminum watercraft designed for challenging conditions was later deployed to search the creek. Bradford was not found. According to Tim Despain, a spokesman for the Alaska State Troopers, because Glacier Creek empties into Cook Inlet just a few miles downstream from the hand tram, Bradford's body could not have been carried outside of the area of the water that they had searched. Over 100 people were involved with the search for Bradford. The Alaska Incident Management Team coordinated the majority of the search effort, but multiple other agencies and organizations were involved in it. Helicopters performed aerial searches, and 10 teams of search dogs were brought in. Their efforts were hampered by a lack of wind. Without the breeze to bring scents to the dogs, they picked up on few scents to follow. Several items, like cough drop wrappers and pieces of food packaging, were found during the search, but given the popularity of the trail, there was no way to say if any of them had been left by Bradford. Authorities found no evidence of foul play in the case or evidence that Bradford was attacked by a large animal. After more than a week of active and intense searches, the teams of people searching for Bradford essentially ran out of places to look for him. The search was scaled back to a limited Bradford brooch remains missing. In 1994, 34-year-old Shannon Shell was living in Tucson, Arizona with her parents. She had moved in with them 5 years earlier following her divorce. She worked at Jason's Deli on East Broadway Boulevard. Shannon enjoyed hiking in her free time. While she was an experienced hiker, she was not a particularly skilled one. She had previously gotten lost for 2 days during a hike. On October 12, 1994, she set out to complete a goal she had previously failed to accomplish. She parked her Camaro at the trailhead of the Tanglewood Ridge Trail in Saguaro National Monument East. Hiking the trail would take her to Manning Camp and would be a 32-mile trek round trip. She had attempted this hike once before and been unable to complete it. This does not necessarily reflect poorly on Shannon or her hiking abilities. The trail is a difficult one to hike and features steep terrain that is difficult for even more accomplished hikers. Bob Love, the chief ranger at Saguaro National Park in 2010, did not believe that Shannon would have been able to complete this hike in a single day. Shannon's timing for the trip also added another level of difficulty for her. She had just recovered from the flu. Shannon locked her valuables, her wallet and some jewelry, in the trunk of the Camaro and set out for her hike. It is believed that she had taken several water bottles, some snacks, extra pieces of clothing, cigarettes, lipstick, and cough drops with her. She never returned from the hike. Over 120 people spent over 2,000 hours searching for Shannon. Helicopters, tracking dogs, and infrared sensors were all used in the effort. 6 miles up the trail, searchers found a fire ring and some footprints. A few items were found nearby that may have belonged to Shannon, but the connection was never confirmed. The search ended after 8 days, and Shannon was presumed dead, although her remains have never been found. In this case, we're in Rugby in Warwickshire, England. Home to the sport of the same name, the history of rugby goes back 100 years. It's home to nearly 80,000 people, and in 2018, one of the people that called it home was Louise Porton, a 23-year-old mother of two. When Louise turned 18, she gave birth to her first child with Chris Draper, a little girl called Lexi. Lexi would soon become a big sister when Louise and Chris had a second child, another little girl, this one named Scarlet. Chris and Louise's relationship would soon sour, and Louise started a new one. She also moved to Rugby from Willenhall and cut off Chris access to his children. He never even met Scarlet, and Louise told her new partner that he was Scarlet's father, which was not true. This relationship would also fall apart. Being a young single mother can be tough and challenging at the best of times, and as a result, Louise had a lot of help from her sister and other family members in looking after her children. She lived with Lexi and Scarlet in a flat at Beechwood Court, and she worked part-time as a model. She was on various social networking sites, and on one of them she described herself as easy to get along with and open to all types of photo shoots, as well as being open to working for pay or trade. Using the name Lollipop, she did photo shoots for a variety of things, including erotic and glamour modeling. Another way that she made money was having sex with men, and she allowed nothing to get in the way of this. She told one of the men that they could have sex in the room that she shared with her children, providing they were quiet. On another occasion, while her children slept unsupervised, she left the flat and had sex with a man in his vehicle. As 2017 came to an end and the new year rolled around, on the 2nd January 2018, her oldest daughter Lexi was admitted to hospital. She was struggling to breathe. After examining her, it was concluded that this was likely the result of a chest infection, and she was discharged. Just 2 days later, on January 4th, paramedics were dispatched to Park Road as Lexi's condition had rapidly deteriorated. Paramedic David Woods Thomas said he had no idea why the child was as ill as she was. She was lying flat on her back, and her life was saved by the skill and knowledge of the paramedics who performed resuscitation. After conducting tests, the paramedics believed her condition could be the result of a severe respiratory illness, and they described her condition as critical. Louise said her daughter had been suffering from seizures. One thing did stand out to David. While Louise appeared to be somewhat upset, she was not as distressed as one might expect when having a young child so seriously unwell. It was again believed to be a chest infection, and she was given more antibiotics. When she was fit enough, Lexi was discharged from hospital. January 15, 2018. The call had been made by Louise Porton. By the time the paramedics arrived at the flat just 9 minutes after the call was placed, the property was noticeably cold. Mark Mitchell was one of the paramedics on shift, and upon entering the flat, he called out that they were now on scene. Louise said, "In here from the bedroom," and the paramedics headed through. Lexi was on the floor by the bed. Louise said she had put Lexi in the bath earlier and then found her unresponsive in bed. Mark tried to open her airway, but her jaw was stiff, as was other parts of her body. Rigor mortis had started to set in. Her skin was pale and mottled, and her lips were blue. He knew that it would be fruitless to make any attempts to revive or resuscitate her. At 12:50 a.m., her time of death was called. Mark had been the one to call her time of death, and he told Louise that Lexi had died and that he believed she had actually been dead for some time already. Louise burst into tears. Mark said she cried for less than a minute before walking out of the bedroom. Lexi was wrapped in blankets, and Mark carried her out to the ambulance. She was driven to University Hospital Coventry while Louise, another paramedic, and a police officer sat in the back. Following this, the sudden unexpected death in infancy and childhood procedures were triggered, and her death was investigated to find a cause. A post-mortem was carried out, and specialist doctors were called in to try and determine why she had died. No natural cause of death could be determined, and the results of the post-mortem were pending. CCTV had shown her going into the flat with Louise and Scarlet just hours before her death. In the footage, she appeared to be happy and chatty. Losing a child is a pain that many of us cannot even better think about, but Louise's behavior was raising questions. Just one day after Lexi had died, Louise had been on the dating app, Meet Me, and accepted 41 friend requests. She had also been on another app, Badoo, and was messaging various men on there. She told one man, "My little girl passed away yesterday," and when he offered his condolences, she simply replied, "It's all right." She had also arranged a date with another man that night. She was cold and flippant about Lexi's death, saying, "I had to, now down to one." When she arrived at the funeral home to talk about the plans for Lexi's service, she did not appear to be a young mother who had suffered such a tragedy so recently. She was heard laughing and joking and was even FaceTiming a man. As investigations into why Lexi had died were carried out, Louise and Scarlet were moved to a nearby hotel. Just 2 days after going to the funeral home for Lexi, and less than 3 weeks after she had died, another call was made to the emergency services. The February 1st, 2018. Louise had been driving around Rugby with her car being seen on Barbie Road, Dunchurch Road, and Russellheim Way. She then stopped in a petrol station to fill up her car. She then pulled into Elliott's Retail Park and made a call to 111, the UK's alternative medical line that is not for life-threatening emergencies. She said she was in the car, and Scarlet was in her car seat, not breathing. The operator asked if she could wake her, and Louise said she couldn't. She said she had made the decision to call 111 as her daughter's condition did not seem urgent, despite the fact she wasn't breathing. When Scarlet was tended to by the paramedics, they were met with every emergency responder's worst nightmare. Baby Scarlet was already dead. It was clear she had been dead for some time. One of the paramedics said that Scarlet was freezing and completely lifeless. The paramedics asked what had happened, and Louise said she had been diagnosed with the flu and that her older sister Lexi had died 2 weeks before. Both of Louise's daughters were now dead, and following Scarlet's passing, Louise was described as being emotionless and calm. Considering she had lost both her children within less than 3 weeks of each other, she did not seem distressed or upset. Her behavior was still detached and cold. When asked about what she wanted to do with her daughter's belongings, her response was to yawn. With both children now having died, it was clear that this was not a tragic coincidence, as doctors could find no natural reason for one of the children to die, let alone both of them. Statuses that Louise's mother Sharon had posted to Facebook showed that the relationship between the two of them was now incredibly strained and had also become violent. On March 11th, 2018, Sharon posted the following: "I really miss you so much, but being called a liar hurts me more than my own daughter punching me last night and knocking me on the floor, then telling me I'm no mother of hers. Thanks, Lou. All I've done since my grandkids passed is stick up for you, so thanks for hitting me. I've always been there for you and never ever said a bad word about you. So thanks for the punch to my head last night for sticking up for you. But no more. You've really hurt your own mom, so thanks, Lou." Just 9 days after these posts, there would be a major development. The March 20th, 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering both her children. The results from the postmortems on both girls had come through, and they had confirmed the worst fears of everyone. They had died from airway obstruction, possibly suffocation, and both Lexi and Scarlet were found to have prior injuries suggesting that they had possibly been previously physically attacked. Baby Scarlet had signs of previous airway obstruction, and there were signs of bleeding in her neck tissue, suggesting that there had been significant pressure applied to her airway. The news was shocking. Louise Porton had one previous conviction from when she was 15 years old for wasting police time. Other than that, there was nothing on her record. Had she now become a double murderer? She denied any wrongdoing and said that she had no clue as to why her children had died. It was clear that her story was just not adding up, and the evidence pointed to this being anything but an accident or tragic coincidence. She was released as the investigations continued. After Louise was arrested, Sharon took to social media to hit back at claims that she knew about what was going on with Louise and her life. She said that people were, quote, spreading shit about her, and she was adamant that she knew nothing. On March 28, 2018, Louise Porton was back on social media. She changed her profile picture on Facebook and added the caption "Smile and the haters." 3 months after her arrest, she had tried to sell bags of her deceased daughter's clothes for just £20 on Facebook in June 2018. 9 months after the deaths of her daughters, she wrote on Facebook, "Mommy's angels, taken from me too soon." You will never be forgotten. Rip. She was still maintaining she had nothing to do with their deaths. The police worked around the clock and continued to build their case against her, and the evidence they found was disturbing. Louise's former landlady from the property she had lived at in Williner from August of 2016 to early November 2017 told the police it was very rare that Louise would ever have the children. She would do whatever she could to not have them with her. Her landlady said Louise would often become frustrated and irritable with her children and swear at them. She said they would cry and not always do what she asked them to do. She would tell them to shut the up, or she would give them something to cry for. On one occasion, Lexi had a temper tantrum and her mom pulled her up by one arm and told her get the F up from the floor. The police also looked at the medical evidence surrounding their deaths, and they found that when Lexi had first been admitted to hospital, her symptoms were consistent with and the result of deliberate airway obstruction and not a chest infection as had been first believed. While Lexi was in hospital, Louise had gone to the toilet and taken sexual photographs of herself in various stages of undress. She had also messaged a photographer and asked for money in return for sexual acts during a photo shoot. She said that for £300, he could do whatever he wanted. She even swapped messages with the security guard that she had met in accident and emergency, with them exchanging 80 messages back and forth, all while her daughter was fighting for her life, having been resuscitated by paramedics. The police would also seize Louise's phone, and this would uncover more damning evidence. Just one day before Lexi's death, she sent a message to a man saying, "I'm just really having a tough time with my 3-year-old being ill from that deadly flu. Doctors telling me she's gonna die." No doctor had said any such thing to her. It wasn't just her text messages that were raising alarm bells. Several disturbing Google searches had also been made after Lexi was discharged from hospital on the January 4th, including, can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? How long after drowning can someone be resuscitated? Why did my 3-year-old stop breathing? She also visited websites that included articles, child revived almost 2 hours after drowning. But how? And 5 weird things that happen after you die. Just hours before she called the emergency services about Lexi, Louise had Googled how long it took for a body to go cold. Louise said that these searches were in no way connected to, and had nothing to do with, her daughter's death. The evidence just continued to mount. In messages she sent to various people, she said she was worried she would lose Scarlet as well. But CCTV from the hotel they were staying in showed that Scarlet appeared to be happy and well. Then, on the February 1st, she messaged a man called Patrick on WhatsApp. The messages read as follows: "Any chance of putting 30 in my bank now for fuel to get my daughter Scarlet to hospital? I will transfer it back Wednesday. She's not well. If you can let me know, I'm not losing another. I'm not losing another baby." Patrick replied, "Call the ambulance. Don't waste any time, hun." Louise said, "I've called, told me to make my way. Can you or not? Please, you'll get it back." It is believed that Louise had murdered Scarlet in the hotel room before carrying her body out to the car, meaning that when she was caught on CCTV putting petrol into her car, Scarlet was likely already dead or dying in the back seat. Louise later told police that the allegation she was already dead when she was put into the car was entirely false. January 2019, 1 year after Lexi's death, the Crown Prosecution Service approved murder charges against Louise. She appeared in a magistrate's court in Leamington Spa and spoke only to confirm her name, date of birth, and address. She denied the charges and told the police in a prepared statement, "My children were never an inconvenience to me, and I accommodated my lifestyle and personal life around them. I still don't know how my daughters died or what caused it. It is correct that life as a single mother was financially difficult, but I never asked anyone for money, and any suggestion that I use my daughter's ill health or death to make money is wholly inaccurate and wrong." As she went through the various court proceedings leading up to the trial, her father was scolded by a judge for taking a photograph of her through the door of the courtroom. Photography inside a court is forbidden in the United Kingdom, but Louise's father Jeffrey said he had believed it would be okay if he photographed her from outside of the court. He said he had done it to show Louise's sister what she looked like, as they hadn't seen each other for some time. The judge decided not to impose a punishment on him, but did say, "I am satisfied that you have not acted through any malicious wish and that this was just an extraordinarily stupid thing to do. Take this as a warning. You've had a lucky escape." He also ordered for the pictures to be deleted. In July 2019, it was finally time for Louise Porton to go on trial. She persisted she was innocent and was not to blame for the deaths of her children. She told the court that her daughters always made her laugh and that she loved them dearly. She added, "It's not one of the easiest things to do, but it was something I could cope at. They were always giving me something to do. I would take them to places, play parks, and try to give them everything they wanted." When asked why she had been engaging in sexually explicit chats and arranging to meet men for sex in exchange for money, she said, "Because I hadn't been paid at the time from Universal Credit." The prosecutor, Oliver Saxby QC, said no doubt she would have needed time to herself, but in the context of what was later to happen, in the context of 2 unexplained deaths, consistent with deliberate airway obstruction, it is hard not to draw the conclusion that for the defendant at times, her 2 children got in the way of her doing what she wanted, when she wanted, and with whom she wanted. The overwhelming inference is that Lexi and Scarlet died because someone deliberately interfered with their breathing. That someone can only have been this defendant. David, the paramedic who had first tended to Lexi on the January 4th, said that when he had been called to the flat again, he believed Louise had a glass of wine in her hand. He told the court, "She said that's the paramedic who looked after my Lexi before she died. She was almost pleased to see me." The paramedic Mark, who had found Scarlet dead in her car seat, also testified, saying it was clear that she had been dead for some time before the call was made to the emergency services. Louise told the court that she had found it difficult to form emotional attachments and struggled to express her emotions, but there was no evidence to suggest that she suffered from any condition that could have explained what she was accused of doing. The court heard that she would regularly ignore her children, preferring to message men on dating apps, telling some that if they funded her shopping, she would send sexual photographs of herself. One of Louise's former friends would later tell a newspaper that she would regularly and routinely leave her children with her father so she could go out drinking and partying at the weekend. The Google searches were damning evidence, as were the many messages she had sent to people claiming that doctors had told her daughter might die when they had said no such thing, and her saying she was worried she would lose Scarlet when she appeared fine in the CCTV footage. The fact she had waited hours before calling the emergency services, depriving her children of any chance of being resuscitated or helped, left people horrified. For those present in the courtroom, it was a disturbing and devastating case to listen to. In August of 2019, a Birmingham Crown Court, and following a trial that had lasted 5 weeks, after 5 hours of deliberation, Louise Porton was unanimously convicted of 2 counts of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years. Mrs. Justice Yip called her evil and calculated. She said, "One way or another you squeezed the life out of each of your daughters, only calling the emergency services when you knew they were dead. I'm sure at the time of their deaths you intended to kill each of your daughters. Why you did so only you will know. Those who loved Lexi and Scarlet have been left bewildered as to how and why you could have done something so evil. These were blameless young children, who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away. The suggestion that your children got in the way of your lifestyle may make for interesting headlines, but it does not truly reflect the evidence at trial. Your daughters did not hold you back from doing what you wanted. The sad truth is the evidence offers no real reason for Lexi and Scarlet's deaths, other than that you, their mother, decided to end their lives. The judge also said that she believed when Lexi was admitted to hospital with breathing difficulties on the 2nd January 4th, these were a result of attempts on her life made by her mother. Chris Draper, Lexi and Scarlet's father, said in an impact statement read on his behalf, "You were their mother, the person supposed to care for them, protect them, and love them. They were just an inconvenience to you. How could you do this? Maybe if social services had listened to me, they would still be alive today. I sit and think day-night, and I can't understand why my 2 little girls were taken away because Louise wanted to sleep around. I hate Louise. No punishment will ever be enough. Only having a short time with Lexi and never meeting Scarlet makes it all the more heartbreaking. We will miss out on all those special occasions they would have celebrated. Their first day of school, birthdays, getting married, having children of their own. The only comfort is that Lexi and Scarlet are together." Louise sat with her head resting on her hands, looking down at her feet. She didn't react at all. Detective Superintendent Pete Hill from Warwickshire Police said he would never be able to understand why Louise murdered her children. She has lied repeatedly to friends, family, and professionals to cover her tracks. And no point throughout the whole investigation has she ever shown any real signs of emotion. Not content with killing one of her children, she did exactly the same to her other daughter. I would like to thank the jury. They diligently went through the appalling details of Porton's crimes. They saw through her lies before returning a guilty verdict. Louise Porton is serving her sentence at HMP Foster Hall and will be eligible for parole in January 2051. It has been reported that Louise has been spat at and verbally abused whilst in prison. In September 2019, the funeral was held in Walsall, and their coffins were taken by a horse-drawn carriage. Their father Chris paid tribute to them online, saying that they were deeply loved and would never be forgotten. He finished his post saying, "Sleep tight, babies. Daddy's got you. Daddy will always have your back. Sleep tight. Love your daddy." Following Louise's conviction, her mother Sharon spoke about her daughter. Something snapped in her head. She became a monster. My wonderful little girl changed. She's not the happy, loving girl I brought up. I no longer consider her my daughter. She added, I cannot believe social services didn't do more. They have blood on their hands. They could have done so much more. Louise didn't care about Alexei's death. She didn't give a damn. There should be an inquiry into why they didn't do more. Who has made the decision that everything is okay with Louise's family and that they can be left alone? Scarlet needed to be taken away for her own safety. According to Sharon, multiple people had called social services in the weeks before Lexi's death, but no action had been taken. In February 2020, it was reported that 48-year-old Sharon had died from suicide. A spokesperson for West Midlands Police said that the police were called after a woman's body was discovered at an address in Willenhall. The death is not being treated as suspicious. The bond between sisters is special and often unbreakable. Lexi and Scarlet should be growing up together and experiencing life with one another. They had so much to offer and loads more to do and see. The one person that should have protected them took all of those opportunities away. To know that they experienced such suffering at the hands of their own mother is frankly too horrible to think about. One can only hope that as time continues to pass, it will give those who loved Lexi and Scarlet the opportunity to begin to heal. Susan Sue Taraskiewicz, one of 3 children, grew up in Saugus, Massachusetts. Known for her creativity, she spent her teenage years helping craft Halloween costumes for younger kids in her neighborhood. After graduating from Saugus High School, Sue pursued her artistic dreams through higher education, first at a local community college and later at the Massachusetts College of Art, aspiring to become a cartoonist. Aware that an art career might not fully sustain her financially, she took a job with Northwest Airlines at Logan International Airport after completing college. Initially starting in roles like cabin cleaning and working the ticket counter, Sue quickly advanced within the company. Within 5 years, she achieved her goal of working on the ramp and became a ramp supervisor. On Saturday, September 12, 1992, she reported to work for her 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. At around 1 a.m. on September 13th, 27-year-old Sue left work to grab sandwiches for herself and her co-workers. She never returned. None of her did anything when she failed to come back for the rest of her shift, which was something that she had never done before during her years with the company. When Sue wasn't home that Sunday morning, her parents assumed that she had gone straight to church. They left home for the day, and when they came back, they looked in Sue's room and saw clothes on the floor. They assumed that they had been left there recently and that Sue had come home and then left for her next shift while they were out of the house. Sue's mother Marlene typically saw Sue coming home from her shifts as she was leaving to go to work, so she was slightly concerned when she left home at 8:30 a.m. on Monday 14th without seeing her daughter. After Marlene arrived at work, she got a phone call from her other daughter, Debbie. Debbie had just gotten a phone call from someone at Northwest asking to speak with Sue. Sue had still not come home even though she was due to go with Debbie to a fitting for her wedding dress. Later that day, Sue's car was found outside an auto body shop on Route 1A in the city of Revere, north of the airport. Sue's body was discovered in the trunk of the car. She had been severely beaten as well as stabbed. Sue had loved the cartoon character Snoopy and had a massive collection of Snoopy memorabilia. She had the opportunity to meet Snoopy's creator, Charles Schulz, 7 months before her murder. After her death, he drew a Snoopy for Sue that was put on her gravestone. Sue was a valuable employee and had advanced to a supervisor position with Northwest. Many of her co-workers appreciated how hard she worked and how far out of her way she would go to help her co-workers. However, her work life was far from perfect. Sue had to fight for her job and fight to keep it. She worked mainly with men and in a position traditionally held by a man. When she finally became a ground services employee working on the ramp as she had hoped, she was only the second woman West had given that position to at Logan International. She had to fight to finally be promoted to a supervisor position there, becoming the first woman to do so. She had initially been passed over for in ground services. They left filthy messages about Sue and photographs of her throughout the airport and urinated on her locker. She received phone calls late at night and a male coworker smashed her radio. Following her promotion, her locker was also vandalized with graffiti, an image of a casket with Sue's name on it. Sue kept a detailed diary of 8 months' worth of these incidents, although according to some of her coworkers, the harassment continued on well beyond the period Sue detailed in her diary. Sue filed reports with both her union and with Northwest, but the behavior continued on unchecked. Sue assumed that she was being targeted by her coworkers simply because they did not want to be working with or for a woman, and that the harassment was being carried out in hopes of getting her to quit her job. She was determined to not be forced out despite the emotional toll that the harassment was taking on her. No one was going to take the job Sue had fought so hard for away from her. Sue's mother Marlene has come to believe that there was an entirely different motive for at least some of the later harassment as well as for Sue's murder. Not long after Sue was killed, several of her coworkers were arrested for being part of a credit card theft ring. The arrests were made as part of a federal investigation that had begun in the summer of 1992. Baggage handlers on the ramp were stealing new cards that arrived at the airport through mail deliveries on Northwest aircraft. They were then either using the cards themselves or selling them. The individuals involved in the ring ultimately stole more than $7 million from the various credit card companies. Sue was not involved in this illegal activity. However, the fact that she was a supervisor meant that she could make decisions that would make continuing the scheme more difficult. For example, if she made sure the employees she was supervising were always at their assigned work site, they would not have time to sneak off to hide the stolen cards. There is no evidence that Sue was aware of the thefts, but if the individuals committing them thought that she was, they may have increased their efforts to harass her with the aim of getting her to quit not just because she was a woman but because she was a threat to their criminal activities. 3 out of the 10 employees who were ultimately sentenced in the case had been named by Sue in her diary as some of the co-workers who had been harassing her. While the incidents listed in the diary predate Sue's promotion, these men's motives for harassing Sue could have shifted over time. If the members of the theft ring became more convinced that Sue was onto them, keeping her from reporting their illegal activity could have been a potential motive in her murder. The Taraskiewicz family sued Northwest Airlines for sexual harassment following Sue's murder. 3 years after her death, Northwest settled with the family for $75,000. They also agreed to provide $250,000 as a reward for information that leads to the arrest of Sue's killer. While the airline no longer exists, the reward fund does. Sue's father and brother have passed away, leaving her mother Marlene and sister Debbie as the main champions for justice in her case. Sue now has 2 nieces and a nephew who have been raised on stories of their Aunt Sue and assurances of how much she would have loved them. Marlene regularly gives interviews and has made 2 videos with the Massachusetts State Police to keep the case active in Peoples and to ask for witnesses to come forward. Even after almost 30 years of looking for answers, her dedication to her daughter's case has not wavered. "I am a very healthy woman, and I am not going away," she said in 2014. Speaking to her daughter's killer, she said, "You are going to look over your shoulder until the day that I go. But I will get you, and I will get justice for my Susan." 38-year-old Jonathan O.J. had Thursday, June 11, 1998, off from work. He was a deputy of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, a canine handler with the Elite Special Bureau. John planned to spend the majority of the day at Devil's Punch Bowl Natural Area, some 20 miles southeast of the home he shared with his wife Deborah and 5-year-old daughter Chloe in Palmdale, California. John was able to handle his prestigious but exceptionally challenging position because of his background as a paratrooper with the Army Special Forces unit and his commitment to remaining in peak physical condition. He was a skilled runner who trained in rugged, remote locations and knew how to survive in the wilderness. He had just completed his 650-mile ultramarathon a few days prior and was at the Punch Bowl 2 for a 100-mile run he would be undertaking in just 2 weeks. Participating in the Western States 100-mile endurance run was a long-held dream of John's, and he had been training for it daily and organizing a support team to assist him for the over hours he would spend running. The mountains south of the Devil's Punch Bowl were a regular training site for him since he was familiar with them, and they helped prepare him for the difficult terrain he would be running over during the endurance run in Northern California. It is believed that Jonathan parked his truck and began his run around 11:45 a.m. Shortly after he began his run, he encountered a group of elementary school students. John and his canine partner, Bosco, had recently spoken to the class at their school, so he stopped to briefly speak with the teacher. He told the teacher that he would be running to the summit of Mount Baden-Powell, which was 20 miles away and back, returning to the parking lot around sundown. 2 park employees saw a man believed to be John in the park over the following several hours, and a third saw a man with a backpack like the one John had taken with him walking towards the parking lot around 6 p.m. Jonathan did not return home as planned, however, and his wife called the Palmdale Sheriff Station to report him missing at 11 p.m. 2 deputies found John's white Ford pickup truck still in the parking lot, and the search and rescue squad with the department was called in to look for John by 11:30. Multiple other organizations and agencies would join the effort the following morning. Even as the search for John went on for over a day, there was still hope that he would be found alive because he was so well trained in outdoor survival and physically fit. However, as several more days went on with no sign of him, despite extensive aerial and ground searches, the optimism began to wane. 6 days after John went missing, the sergeant leading the search announced to the search teams that it was believed that John had committed suicide. While the official search ended, friends of John's and members of law enforcement continued looking for him on their own. The closest thing to physical evidence that John took his own life was the fact that his off-duty firearm, which he did not normally take with him on runs, was unaccounted for. A local resident had also reported hearing what they believed to be a gunshot in the early evening hours of June 11th. The suicide theory was best supported by John's mental state at the time of his disappearance. John had been going through a difficult time. His marriage was falling apart, and he and Deborah had gone to their first to join therapy session a day before he vanished. On the morning of June 11th, he had told Deborah to have a nice life and tell Chloe that he loved her before he left to drive out to the site for his run. At the time, Deborah thought that these statements indicated that he was through with their marriage, although she realized that they could have indicated that he was suicidal after he failed to return home. Most of John's loved ones do not believe that he would have taken his own life, however. Most importantly, he was dedicated to his daughter Chloe. He was also excited about a new romantic relationship he was pursuing. John was tired of living in Southern California and had been looking into moving to a remote part of Alaska, where he will be surrounded by few people and many opportunities for outdoor activities. John's sister believes he may have staged his disappearance and left for Alaska under a new name. One of the other reasons John had wanted to leave California was the explosion of crime in the more rural areas of the Antelope Valley. 6 violent drug rings were producing massive amounts of methamphetamine in the area. These drug rings and the investigation into them by the authorities would prove to have numerous, uncorroborated connections to John's disappearance. Within the first week of John going missing, 2 individuals with ties to biker gangs producing meth in the area told authorities that John had come across a meth lab that was operating underground near the area where he had last been heading during his run. In their words, John was then taken care of. By early 2000, 9 more individuals connected to the meth trade had provided the same story. Some of them also reported that the resident deputy assigned to the area that included Devil's Punch Bowl Natural Area had been involved in John's disappearance. A Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy being involved with criminal activity was not inconceivable. 35 deputies from the department had been indicted for stealing $1 million from drug dealers in the early 1990s. Other deputies were arrested for unrelated crimes, and the FBI had video evidence of other criminal activity committed by deputies. The sheriff at the time had asked the FBI for assistance in removing the corrupt deputies from his department, but he passed away in 1998. By that time, rumors were circulating that deputies were working with the drug rings, warning them in advance of any planned raids. Homicide detective Larry Brandenburg learned of John's potential murder and the alleged involvement of the resident deputy in December of 1999. He found a location near Devil's Punch Bowl that could have been the site of the underground meth lab the informants had described, and collected evidence that seemingly corroborated some of their statements. Based on these findings, he applied for a search warrant to examine the phone and financial records of the local resident deputy to see if his involvement in the case could be corroborated. The district attorney signed off on the warrant, but when Brandenburg took the paperwork to his boss for his signature, not only did he refuse to sign it, but he ultimately took Brandenburg off the case when he tried to pursue it further. During his investigation, Detective Brandenburg had asked Deputy Darren Hager to speak with one of his informants about the resident deputy's involvement with drug rings. The informant claimed that the resident deputy was involved with drug trafficking and potentially John's disappearance. When Hager reported this information to his superiors, he was told not to investigate any wrongdoing by other deputies or John's disappearance. Information about the former was to go to Internal Affairs, and information about the latter should be sent to Detective Brandenburg. In March of 2000, Hager had been assigned to a joint task force with the Drug Enforcement Agency. Operation Silent Thunder, as it was called, spent almost a year infiltrating local drug rings, setting up wiretaps, and obtaining informants. The operation resulted in the arrests of hundreds of people who were prosecuted by the state of California, 32 federal convictions, and 5 out of the 6 area kingpins going to prison. In 2002, Hager traveled to Washington, D.C., to be presented with the DEA's Administrator's Award in honor of his work on the operation. During the course of the operation, Hager had witnessed specific incidents of deputy misconduct and learned of specific connections the resident deputy alleged to be involved in John's disappearance may have had to a local drug dealer. He also had 3 new witnesses provide information about John's disappearance. One of them claimed to have witnessed his murder, one claimed to know where his body was buried, and the third said that he had heard screaming after he saw John walk in the direction of 2 armed bikers the day he went missing. As instructed, Hager passed all of this information on to other departments. The homicide captain, who had previously refused to sign off on Detective Brandenburg's application for a search warrant, refused to meet with members of the task force to discuss the new leads, or assigned a detective to follow up on them. In June of 2002, the resident deputy, suspected of wrongdoing, and 5 other deputies filed a complaint against Hager, claiming that he had used falsified documents and warrants to defame the resident deputy during his time on the task force. Within a week, the department concluded that all of the witnesses Hager had identified who had been vetted by the DEA and were being used in federal court cases were all unreliable, and that John O.J. had taken his own life because of his marital problems. Hager was reassigned while he was investigated by Internal Affairs for the next 11 months. At the end of the investigation, Hager faced 2 charges: falsifying information and conducting a personnel investigation of the resident deputy. The first charge was based on errors and summaries Hager had not written. The standard punishment for these offenses under the disciplinary guidelines of the department was a 15-day suspension. Instead, Hager was fired despite having been rated as outstanding during his 3 previous performance reviews with the department. Hager could not find work due to the nature of these charges and eventually filed for bankruptcy protection. He filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against both Los Angeles County and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, alleging that his termination was whistleblower retaliation. A jury awarded him $4,500,000 in lost earnings and damages. The county and department appealed the judgment for the following 3 years, but eventually had to pay Hager $2,500,000 plus interest, which made his final payout around $3 million. Hager, no longer feeling safe within the jurisdiction of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, has since moved out of the area. In 2015, John's wife, Deborah, was homeless and living in her car, supporting herself with only a $950 a month disability check she receives because she cannot work due to an extreme form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And his daughter Chloe was living in Los Angeles with her boyfriend and his mother. In March of 2020, a woman named Chloe O.J., who was the same age as John's daughter, passed away in Idaho, although it is unconfirmed if this woman was John's daughter or just another woman with the same name. In the more than 20 years since John disappeared, no sign of him or his remains has ever been found. Specialist Enrique Roman Martinez was a paratrooper and human resource specialist assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in North Carolina in May of 2020. The 21-year-old was from Chino, California, and had 2 older sisters. His mother, Maria, raised her 3 children largely on her own and worked 2 jobs to support them. Enrique had joined the Army at the age of 17 despite concerns held by his family. He was aware of the potential risks, but hoped that his time serving his country would instill discipline and responsibility in him, as well as provide him with the means to eventually attend college. He had a difficult time following his father's deportation when Enrique was just 11 years old, and eventually his grades started to suffer. Enrique believed that the character development and college benefits he would receive from the Army would put him back on track to achieve his goals. He received numerous decorations during his service, including the Army Good Conduct Medal and the National Defense Service Medal. Enrique had been a shy child who became more social as he grew up, but he was still somewhat of an introvert. It took some time for him to open up to others, but he was quick to cheer up anyone who was feeling down. He was somewhat of a homebody, liking to stay home and play video games. As a result of his sweet and caring nature, he did not like confrontation. For Memorial Day weekend of 2020, Enrique went camping with 7 other soldiers, 6 men and 1 woman, on South Corbanks, a small island off the coast of North Carolina that is a part of the Cape Lookout National Seashore. He was last seen alive at their campsite near mile marker 46 just before midnight on Friday, May 22nd. At 7 p.m. the following day, 19 hours after Enrique was last seen, one of the other soldiers he had been camping with called 911 to report him missing. The other campers claimed that Enrique had walked away from their campsite just before midnight wearing nothing but a pair of blue shorts. Enrique's phone, wallet, eyeglasses, and other belongings were all found at the campsite. The soldier who called 911 told the dispatcher that they had gone to bed at 12:03 a.m. Saturday morning and that Enrique was still gone when they woke up. "And when was the last time you saw him?" "So we all went to bed at mid at 12:03, and that is the last time he saw him." The caller also told the dispatcher that the group had spent all day looking for Enrique and trying to find park rangers to ask for help without success. "When we woke up, he was not here, and we've been looking for him all day. We were trying to find the park ranger or their offices or anything." However, there was a problem with this assertion. Between 1 and 2 p.m., the group had been approached by 2 park rangers who asked them to move their vehicles, which were illegally parked too close to the sand dunes. The rangers were clearly rangers dressed in park ranger uniforms and driving marked vehicles. The group agreed to move their cars, but no one in the group informed the park rangers that a member of their party was missing. The caller also claimed that he had reason to believe that Enrique had harmed himself. "We might be afraid that he might have hurt himself, but we're really not sure. He wasn't diagnosed, but he did have suicidal tendencies." Enrique's family has vehemently denied this claim. Enrique's sister, Griselda, has said that the tone of her conversations with her brother had changed over the previous year, but this change was because Enrique was focused on his future plans with his family, not because he no longer wanted to have a future. Enrique had been unhappy in North Carolina because he was anxious to return home to his family and begin the next chapter of his life. He was less than a year away from completing his service with the Army. He was scheduled to receive a medical discharge because he suffered from chronic compartment syndrome in his legs, a condition which limited his ability to run for long distances. He had the option of undergoing surgery to try to correct the problem, but the success of such a surgery was not guaranteed. Enrique planned to instead take the medical discharge and move back to California to be with his family and use his military benefits to enroll in college, where he wanted to study pharmacology and psychology. He hoped to one day have a career providing medical treatments for individuals suffering from mental illness. He also had a more short-term dream of taking a trip to Japan with his sister Griselda. Enrique had already made plans to move in with Griselda when he returned to California. He had talked to her just 2 days before he went missing, and the siblings had discussed how they would set up his bedroom and what kind of car he wanted to buy when he got back to California. While it can be argued that Enrique's family was not qualified to declare him free of any serious mental illness, the same amount of skepticism should be applied to the other soldiers' ability to diagnose Enrique as suicidal. Griselda and her mother, Maria, traveled to North Carolina as soon as they heard that Enrique was missing. When they arrived at South Core Banks, they became even more convinced that had not simply wandered off into the night. There were no wooded areas or dense vegetation that could have hidden Enrique in the immediate area where he was last seen. According to Park Ranger Nate Toring, it is very difficult to get lost on the island for a long period of time without some sort of extenuating circumstance because of the island's geography. While the island is 26 miles long, it is very narrow with little interior land to disappear into. Enrique's family was also alarmed by the fact that he had left the campsite without his glasses. He could not see without them and would have had an even more difficult time without them while it was dark outside. A massive search was launched for Enrique. Multiple agencies searched the area, beginning at the campsite and working out from there, from the air and on the ground. The ocean and nearby sounds were also searched. The Army Criminal Investigation Command, the Coast Guard, the North Carolina Marine Patrol, the K-9 team from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, and the Carteret County Sheriff's Office were all a part of the search. Unfortunately, several of the days following Enrique's disappearance were rainy and windy, leading to rough waters and complications for the search effort. Few clues were found over the following several days. On May 29th, partial human remains washed ashore on Shackleford Banks, another barrier island just west of South Core Banks. They were sent to the medical examiner's office, and a week later, it was confirmed that the remains were of Enrique. His dental records were used to make the identification. The medical examiner's office ruled Enrique's death a homicide, and the Army Criminal Investigation Command is investigating it as such. They are currently offering a $25,000 reward for information that leads to the apprehension and conviction of Enrique's killer or killers. Because of their ongoing investigation, Army CID has released very little information about the case to the public in order to protect any possible future prosecution of whoever killed Enrique. Unfortunately, this also means that they have had to leave Enrique's family without many answers as well. An unnamed Army official did tell ABC News that there is no suspicion that the murder was a reprisal or hate crime. The medical examiner's office also told Griselda Martinez that her brother's injuries were consistent with dismemberment rather than with coming in contact with a boat propeller or wildlife after he was in the water. There is not an animal in that sea that could have done that, she was told. While Army CID cannot provide them with information right now, Enrique's family believes that they are working diligently on Enrique's case. They also suspect that they may have a person of interest in the case, but not enough evidence to make an arrest. They have therefore been very active in the media, imploring anyone with information to come forward. Given the inconsistencies and problems with the account provided by the other soldiers Enrique was camping with, it seems most likely that a big break in the case will come from one of them providing a more complete statement. However, they are not the only potential witnesses. Because it was a holiday weekend, South Core Banks was very busy at the time Enrique went missing. Park Ranger Nate Toring estimates that there were thousands of visitors to the island that weekend, any number of whom could have seen something that they did not realize was important at the time. According to his family's religious beliefs, Enrique's soul will not be at peace until his killer has been found. Enrique's mother, Maria, is too distraught to even sleep, and his sister Griselda is both haunted and pushed onward in her quest for justice by a conversation she had with Enrique many years before his death. He asked me one time, "Will you always be there to protect me?" I said yes, Griselda recounted. Now that it's happened, it breaks my heart. I feel guilty that I couldn't protect him. The most I can do is find out what happened to him. This story takes us to Tullamore, a small town in County Offaly, Ireland, where 23-year-old Ashling Murphy lived in 2022. Bright, driven, and hardworking, Ashling had dreamed of becoming a teacher from a young age. She was ecstatic to land a position as a primary school teacher at Doru National School just months after graduating. Her colleagues remarked that she adapted seamlessly, as if she had always been part of their team. Her father described her as tireless, always striving to achieve more and make the most of each day. Ashling encouraged her students to challenge themselves but led by example, never asking them to do what she wouldn't do herself. She even took on learning the Uillean pipes, one of the most challenging instruments, determined to prove that with dedication, she could master it. Music and the creative arts were central to Ashling's life, a passion she inherited from her musical mother, Kathleen. During her school years, she participated in the choir, the orchestra, the camogie team, and the traditional music group, embodying her love for creativity and teamwork. But playing the fiddle had stuck with her since she was little. She was eventually in the top 5% of fiddle players in the country and had played at Tullamore Tradfest Traditional Music Festival as well. Ashling was a family girl through and through and would always make time for dinner and drinks with her dad Ray, mother Kathleen, sister Amy, and brother Cole. She was also in a great relationship with her partner Ryan. The pair had first met each other at a disco when they were 15. They had dated for a couple of years, but they were very young and went their separate ways. They did keep in contact though, and a couple of years later they reconnected and were inseparable from that point on. They had started making plans to build their dream house together, get married, and start a family. Ryan said she had the most comforting smile and infectious laugh, and no matter how low you felt, she could always pick you up. On January 10th, 2022, Ashling went to Ryan and his family's house to drop some groceries off at the door. They were all isolating as there was COVID in the home, and Ryan said he really wanted to give her a hug, but they just said hi and bye at the door, knowing they would be seeing each other properly in 10 days, time to go on a trip together. 2 days later, Ashling finished teaching as usual and got ready to go for a jog. She worked out whenever she had time, and a quick run down by the canal to clear her head was a normal thing for her to do. Before she left, she told her mom where she was going, but Kathleen was worried, saying she should jog somewhere else. She hugged her mom and said, Mom, I'm 23 years old. Love you," before heading out the door. She was soon out and jogging down by the Grand Canal, a lovely area for some peace and quiet, where you can often find people working out and walking their dogs. At 3:15 on Fiona's Way, a walkway named after a missing woman called Fiona Penda, 2 women were also jogging down by the bank and saw and heard something odd. They noticed a bicycle on the side and then heard what sounded like a woman crying from the wooded area next to the pathway. They thought she had fallen off her bike and was hurt, so went to go and help. They saw a man cowering over her and pinning her down. A small necklace hung around the woman's neck. The name on it was Ashling. The man heard them, turned around, and through gritted teeth and snarling, told them to go away. The jogger said the woman was moving every part of her body, twisting and turning, trying to get away, but she wasn't making a sound anymore. Neither woman had a phone on them and there was no one else around, so they both shouted at him that they would call the Gardaí and then ran to the nearest house to get help. Authorities were soon there and found Ashling Murphy, lying there motionless. Her attacker was long gone. Despite the best efforts of the paramedics, Ashling died at the scene. She had been strangled and stabbed 11 times in the neck, dying of blood loss. Her keys were close to her, and it was clear she had tried to fight off her killer using them. Experts said Ashling had clearly fought so incredibly hard to get away and tried everything she could until the very end. The joggers had given a description of the man as best they could. His jacket was distinctive, a navy padded bomber jacket with unique stitching on the back. The bicycle that was near the scene, believed to have been his, was a Falcon Storm mountain bike with straight handlebars and green on the frame. A number of people who were in the area around that time contacted the authorities, but there was nothing concrete. Accessing the data on her Fitbit, they were able to get a clearer timeline to try and narrow things down. Her workout had started at 2:51 p.m. 30 minutes later, it tracked erratic movements. Just a couple of minutes later, at 3:31 p.m., her Fitbit was no longer recording her heartbeat. The Garda issued a statement announcing that they believed they were only looking for one person, and they felt confident that whoever this was totally random and not known to Ashling. They said he would probably have wounds, cuts, or bruising on him, given the way Ashling had fought back and used her keys. The detectives would get a lead based off of the descriptions, and just a few hours after Ashling was found, they made an arrest of a 40-year-old man, but he was soon released without charge. The man was taken to safe accommodation when his name and pictures were shared on social media, resulting in him receiving death threats, even though he was innocent. Ashling's case was huge, and everyone was talking about it and trying to help and offer support. It was soon on every news station and flooding social media, both in Ireland and abroad. As always, when crimes like these happen, ones that receive such media attention, people are quick to give their opinions online, and sadly in this case, many seemed focused on the fact that she was out for a run in a slightly secluded area. Activist Laura Bates wrote an emotional response to this, pointing out that focusing on this is a complicated form of victim blaming. I understand why people are posting she was going for a run. I get why she was just walking home and she did all the right things. Trended after Sarah Everard died, she posted in part, I know it comes from a place of grief and rage, but it doesn't matter what they were doing. We say she was just doing this or she was just doing that. It suggests that the case wouldn't have been quite so awful or tragic if she had been doing something else. It had now been 48 hours since Ashling was killed, and many a vigil was being held all over, including ones held by big political names across the country. Thousands and thousands of people were turning out for them. The principal of the school she taught at said everyone was so shaken by what had happened. It's very, very hard to think that she was here in school yesterday as a teacher and teaching her first-class students. And today, they have come in with little tears in their eyes and their teacher not there. On January 14th, 100 people stood outside the Irish Parliament in Dublin for Ashling, and by 4 p.m. the number had grown to 1,000. And soon the Taraskiewicz, the Republic of Ireland's Prime Minister at the time, Michael Martin, and the future leader Leo Varadkar would be there too. Leo Varadkar said the murder of Ashling had united the nation in solidarity and revulsion. The investigation was moving quickly, although the Gardaí were keeping their cards close to their chests. On January 17th, they said that significant progress had been made, as although they didn't announce this to the public, they had actually received a troubling email, which read in part, "To who it may concern, I am the person responsible for Ashling's murder. I am so sorry." The email was sent at 10:44 p.m., and detectives quickly managed to identify where it had come from. They tracked down the person the account had belonged to. The man that had sent it said he suffered from mental health problems and drank too much, blacking out and having little recollection of what he'd done when he was drunk. But sober, he said he didn't know why he had sent it and that he had nothing to do with Ashling's murder. Officers initially felt so confident with this lead, but more checks would rule this man out completely and they were back at square one. But they then got another tip which would turn into the major breakthrough that they so desperately needed. They had been closely watching a man who had walked into a hospital quite a distance from where Ashling was killed just 2 days after that fateful day. The 31-year-old had turned up looking to treat some bad cuts, bruises and scratches to his face. Given how quickly the news of what had happened to Ashling had traveled, the guard were called in by the nurses at the hospital, wondering if there was a link. The man couldn't explain his injuries and was keeping quiet, but he was in quite bad shape. When detectives got there, they too were suspicious and carried out a background check on him. Following this, they went to seize and search 2 cars and search 2 properties as well. One over an hour away in Dublin and one just 8 minutes away from where Ashling had been killed. They interviewed the 31-year-old in hospital and he told them he had been attacked by a man in a blue face mask. A hard thing to pick out given the fact that the pandemic was still ongoing and most people were in masks. He claimed he couldn't really remember it at all as it had happened so quickly. Detectives weren't convinced and showed him a picture of Ashling. He said he had never seen her before, not even on the news. "I look at the news but don't speak English. Can't understand it," he said. They knew there was more to the story but left him to stew over what they had said, ready to come back and talk to him later. A short time after he spoke to the detectives again. This time he told them the man that had attacked him also attacked Ashling as they were all on the same path. He claimed he had tried to save Ashling and not hurt her. But then his story changed again. He suddenly blurted out, "I did it. I murdered. I am the murderer." He was immediately cautioned and was told he did not need to say anything else. But he couldn't stop talking. He said, "I'm sorry. I see girl I never see before. Knife I used for chain. When she passed, I cut her. I cut her neck. She panicked. He then started crying and asked, will I go for 10 years? He pointed to his stomach, which had 3 puncture wounds likely inflicted by Ashling's keys. He gave a DNA sample and, sure enough, the DNA from under Ashling's fingernails was a match to him. As detectives continued to piece things together, on January 18th, hundreds of people gathered for Ashling's funeral. It was attended by the then Payshock, Nicole Martin, President Michael D. Higgins and his wife Sabina, and Minister for Justice Helen McKenzie. Schools around the country observed a minute's silence at 11 a.m. in her memory as well. Her young students would also pay tribute to the 23-year-old, lining up holding pictures of Ashling as the funeral procession came past. Ryan was beside himself and he gave a huge speech on behalf of his and Ashling's families. He said, "She is the greatest love of my life. I will cherish the last 5 years we spent together my entire life. I hope that someday, God willing, we can be reunited once more and continue the great plans we have made for each other. Goodbye for now, but not forever, darling, as you will live on in all of our hearts and memories." It was already a deeply emotional day and things were about to take another turn. This was also the day that the Gardaí announced the man they had been closely monitoring in hospital had been arrested and charged with Ashling's murder. They would finally identify him as Joseph Puszka. He was a builder and had moved over to Ireland from Slovakia in 2015, living in Tullamore with his wife and 5 children. That evening he appeared in Tullamore District Court and the outside was packed with members of the public and media. The Gardaí received more information about Joseph's actions in the hours before he killed Ashling, and it was truly shocking. And Marie Kelly first saw Joseph on his bike. She had stepped aside to let him past and he went past really slowly, staring at her in a menacing way, a way that had really unsettled her. And Marie then saw Joseph again at the canal. This time he was walking behind her and pushing his bike. She could feel him staring at her and picked up her pace. Fortunately, she spotted a man in a van pull up and jogged over towards him. Joseph quickly took off. He also followed 3 other women that day, even being caught on camera a few times. After this, he would find Ashling. Authorities believe he was absolutely on a mission to hurt or kill someone. They also described him as a phantom individual, someone that had never been on their radar for any reason until this point. Despite his own confession, he entered a plea of not guilty stating that he couldn't remember admitting to anything in the hospital. He was now back to the story where he alleged he was trying to save Ashling's life from another man. As he sat in custody, the investigation continued. On June 13, 2023, 5 other people were arrested and charged with withholding information or impeding an arrest in relation to Ashling's case. Marek Puszka, Lyubomir Kushka and Lucia Estakova were charged with withholding information, and Josefina Gruntsova and Vera Gaziova were accused of impeding the apprehension or prosecution of an alleged offender. By the time his trial started on October 17, 2023, the prosecution had CCTV, DNA, and witness evidence as well as his own confession. His defense team was still running with the story that he had been attacked by a man, hence his injuries, and after the man had attacked him, he had killed Ashling before running away. They said the 2 women jogging had actually seen Joseph trying to stop the bleeding, not that he had been hurting her. The prosecution called his lies foul and contemptible. They said the fact he was trying to play some sort of good Samaritan was disgusting. The only victim was Ashling. On November 9, 2023, after just 2 hours of deliberations, he was unanimously found guilty of murder. As the verdict was read out, he sat in silence, putting his hands over his face. Judge Mr. Justice Tony Hunt did not hold back in his statements after he told the jury, "We have evil in this room. There is no doubt about that. There will be a day of reckoning for Puszka." He said that he agreed with the jury's decision and was glad that they didn't spend any more time than they needed to on what he called Joseph's nonsense. He acknowledged that this was no reflection of his legal team, however, saying what they had in their hands was poor stuff indeed. He described what happened to Ashling as enough to make you physically ill, and given what the jury had to sit through, he exempted them from jury service for 20 years. As the jury left the room, everyone erupted into applause. Friday, November 17, 2023 was the day of Joseph's sentencing. Mr. Justice Tony Hunt told Joseph that there was only one sentence to hand down, which he said was richly deserved. Joseph Pushka was handed a mandatory life sentence. Ryan addressed Joseph and said, "You have no idea the love we had for each other. Because of you, I will never get to marry my soul mate. Because of you, I have to somehow carry on without her." You smirked, you smiled, and you showed no remorse, which sums up the kind of person you are, the epitome of pure evil. When your day of reckoning comes, may you be in hell a whole half hour before God even knows you are dead. Joseph did not make eye contact with anyone who spoke, including the judge. Mr. Justice Tony Hunt said that if he had the power, a whole life order would have been considered in this case. He said that before Joseph could be considered for release, the person making that decision would have to take into account that we still don't know why he murdered Ashling. He has never shown any remorse or empathy and has done nothing but lie about what happened, and this will all be taken into consideration. Shortly after he was sentenced, he was transferred to a padded cell in another prison and put under 24-hour surveillance. A source has claimed he had made an attempt to take his own life while on trial, and other inmates said they would be looking for him in prison. Joseph's family still believe he is innocent. It is clear to see how much Ashling meant to so many people and how much her death had outraged not just her small community but Ireland as a whole. Some important conversations were started about safety, education, and continuing to tackle violence against women and girls. People banded together and united in such a huge way. Every case is horrific, and it goes without saying they all affect vast amounts of people at a time. But sometimes certain cases are so emotionally charged that they ripple through the nation and further afield, leaving a lasting impact in ways we have not experienced before. Sarah Everard in the UK, cases like Anna Kriegel in Gilmar in Ireland and Australia, and now Ashling Murphy. Her partner Ryan said the painful thing to come to terms with is that he will have to remember her for longer than he's known her. Amy said, "We are consumed by what can only be described as nightmares, that we weren't there to save her. Ashling did so much for absolutely everybody, yet no one was there when she needed them most. As a big sister, I could not protect her while she was alive. All I can do now is protect her memory. And as a family, we will continue to set the table for 5. In 1970, Betty Lee Jones was a 23-year-old mother of 2 children. As of March 8th that year, she had been married for 9 days, although the last 2 of those days had been spent fighting. She and her husband, Robert Ray Jones, had such a bad argument that day outside of their home near the intersection of 12th Avenue and York Street in Denver, Colorado, that Robert got into his car and drove off. Betty, in turn, began trying to flag down passing cars, and eventually a blue sedan stopped and picked her up. This occurred at approximately 3:30 p.m. Betty was never seen alive again. Around 8:30 the following morning, 2 employees of the Colorado Department of Transportation found Betty's body on the side of an embankment along Highway 128 near the border of Jefferson and Boulder counties. She was bound and had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and shot. Investigators initially identified 6 suspects in the case. While a witness reported that Betty had been trying to flag down passing cars, police did not rule out the possibility that Betty had called someone to come pick her up at some point during that final argument with her husband. As such, several of her former boyfriends were looked at as potential suspects. Her husband also fell under suspicion, and her family considered him to be the most likely suspect for decades. Nothing conclusively tied any of the suspects to the murder, however, and Betty's case went cold. Betty's son and daughter were adopted by her parents following her death. When her son, Benji, would ask his grandfather to tell him about his mother, he would smile at him and simply say, "She was wonderful." In 2006, Betty's case was reopened and assigned to Detective Steve Ainsworth of the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. He submitted evidence from the case to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in hopes of developing a DNA profile. The lab was able to DNA database. Detective Ainsworth tracked down the original 6 suspects in the case, who were by this time living throughout the country, to compare their DNA to the profile found on Betty's body. Betty's husband, Robert Ray Jones, had passed away in 2000, but his parents submitted samples of their DNA for comparison. Based on their DNA, Robert was excluded as a suspect. None of the 5 other original suspects were a match either. In 2019, the DNA profile was then submitted to Bode Technologies, who prepared the sample to be utilized by the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team. The team developed the suspect's family tree and considered and eliminated individuals within it until they had one potential lead left, an unidentified woman listed in the 1957 Denver directory. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had also been working with genetic genealogy, and they were eventually able to identify this woman. She was married and had 2 sons, who would have been in their 20s at the time of Betty's murder. They had also been living in Denver at that time. One of the brothers had passed away in 1977, but the other was interviewed by authorities and agreed to provide a DNA sample. During his interview, he notified investigators that he in fact had another brother named Paul. However, Paul was estranged from the family, and he had not seen or heard from Paul since February of 1970. At that time, Paul drove a blue 1960s Plymouth Fury sedan, which was consistent with the car Betty was seen getting into on March 8, 1970. The brother was unable to provide any current information about Paul or where he living. When his DNA was analyzed, it showed that he was a very close relative of Betty's killer, so tracking down Paul became the main focus of the investigation. Detective Ainsworth did eventually locate Paul Leroy Martin. However, he found him at the Fort Logan National Cemetery, where he was buried following his death in June of 2019. His estranged brother was his only living relative. After obtaining a court order, authorities had Paul's body exhumed on April 8, 2020. And the following day, a sample taken from his remains was submitted to the Forensic Sciences Biological Unit of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for DNA testing. 2 weeks later, they reported their results. Paul Leroy Martin's DNA was a match to the DNA found on Betty Lee Jones's body. On May 26, 2020, the Boulder County District Attorney approved a probable cause statement, meaning that had Martin still been alive, he would have been charged with Betty's murder. While Martin's death means he will never serve time in prison for Betty's murder, her family is still relieved to finally have answers. Just having the closure is amazing for us, Betty's son Benji told the Boulder Daily Camera following Martin's identification. It gives me a lot of hope. It gives my family hope that others will find closure on some of their cases. They are also grateful that law enforcement never gave up on the case. We praise God for bringing us people like Steve Ainsworth, Benji said. He worked so hard on this, and I could tell in his voice the compassion he has and the diligence he has and the work ethic to exhaust every resource possible and everything at his disposal to finish this. May 17, 1999 started out as a typical morning for 39-year-old Saad Kawaf. Around 9:30 a.m., he got ready to leave his home in the gated community of Deerwood on the south side of Jacksonville, Florida, to go to the bank. He and his wife owned the Forest Discount Store at Forest and Beach Boulevards in Jacksonville, and he made large cash deposits several times a week. He said goodbye to his wife and walked out of the house. A few minutes later, however, his wife heard a scream from outside. She opened the door to her garage and saw her husband being attacked by a man. Then a woman attacked Mrs. Kawaf, dragging her back into the house and tying her up. Mrs. Kawaf fought against her attacker, baiting her as she tried to get away. The 2 attackers ran off with the money Saad had been taking to the bank, approximately $30,000 in cash. Mrs. Kawaf survived the attack, having sustained only minor injuries, but Saad had been beaten and stabbed multiple times and died from his injuries. Saad's friends, family, and employees were all devastated by his loss. Customers left flowers outside of his store. A $100,000 reward was offered for information that led to the arrest of his killers. Mrs. Kawaf was able to provide descriptions of the people who killed her husband. They were both white, and the man had been between 5 feet 9 inches 6 feet tall. He had reddish blonde hair and a graying mustache. The woman had been very petite, slim, and around 5 feet 2 inches tall. Curiously, she had worn a long skirt to the robbery and murder. A composite was developed of the female attacker and shown to employees of the store and to neighbors, but no one recognized her. One of the co-op's neighbors had been out walking her dog around the time of the murder and saw an unfamiliar red Jeep Cherokee drive away from the Coof's home. The owner of the Jeep was never identified. Police were also unsure of how the Jeep gained access to the gated neighborhood, as it was not in the gatehouse records or accounted for by any of the residents. Fingerprints and DNA were left behind at the scene. 2 DNA profiles were isolated in 2003. The DNA from the female attacker was left behind from the bite wound Mrs. Kawaf inflicted on her, and police have confirmed that the second profile was from the male attacker but have not discussed exactly how it was left at the scene. The DNA was run through criminal databases several times in the ensuing years, but no matches were ever found. In May of 2020, therefore, the profiles were submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory so that genetic genealogy could be used to uncover the identities of the 2 suspects. In June of 2020, the lab was able to do just that. The male suspect was 64-year-old William Bear, and the female suspect was 50-year-old Melissa Jo Schaefer. The 2 had been married at the time of Saad's murder but had since divorced. Bear was taken into custody in Jacksonville on the evening of July 1, 2020, and Schaefer was taken into custody in Jefferson City, Missouri the following day. They have both been charged with murder and armed robbery. Bear had been an active of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office at the time of Saad's murder, working specifically as a detective with the Intelligence Division. He had been assigned to surveil the Kawaf home. The Sheriff's Office suspected that Saad was selling pseudoephedrine, a controlled decongestant, illegally at his store, and they knew that he kept large amounts of cash in the house. Bear joined the Sheriff's Office in 1975 and retired from it in 2002. Concerns have already been raised that his arrest could lead to new appeals from any number of people convicted based on his testimony or through his investigations over his 27 years with the department. Bear also testified to a grand jury in 2003 after his retirement as a part of a police corruption investigation. Schaefer does not appear to have been returned to Florida as of July 17. Bear is being held without bond and his next court appearance is scheduled for July 23rd. Following the arrests, Saad's niece, Heather Kyle, released a statement on behalf of the family. "Not a day has gone by that we don't miss our beloved Saad. The past 21 years have been the hardest to not only be without a man who meant so much to our family, but to know that the people who did this were not held accountable for their actions. We are grateful to the brave members of the Cold Case Unit and all members of law enforcement who have worked tirelessly on our behalf to ensure justice and that Saad's memory will never be forgotten." Susan Eeds was one of 5 children. She was beautiful and vivacious, and according to her brother, Dennis, she was a spitfire. In 1983, she was working as a waitress in several bars in the greater Houston area and taking DJ gigs as she could find them. On August 30th, 1983, Susan worked at the Prickly Pear, a bar inside of the Holiday Inn in Webster, Texas. After getting off work early, she went to the nearby Jason's Brown Saloon. This would be the last place she was ever seen alive. Witnesses would later report that a white male wearing a cowboy hat had asked Susan to dance at the saloon, but she declined. She was later seen leaving the establishment alone. The following day, Susan's body was found in a vacant lot near the intersections of NASA Road 1 and Elam Street in Seabrook, Texas. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with the jumpsuit she had been wearing the night before. Her car, a 1976 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, was located in the parking lot of Gulf States Yachts, a boat store not far from the crime scene. Susan's purse, her Clear Lake High School class ring, and the gold necklace she had been seen wearing the night before were all missing. Authorities were able to develop a composite sketch of the man seen talking to Susan at Jason's, but with little physical evidence at the location where she was found, they had few other leads to follow. Shortly after Susan's death, her mother, Shirley, began receiving strange phone calls. At first, the caller would hang up when Shirley answered the phone. Eventually, he began speaking to her. By this time, Shirley had already notified the police of the calls and they had arranged for her to be able to record them. The caller identified himself as Bill and claimed to live on Telephone Road in Houston. He told Shirley he had photographs of Susan and talked about the possibility of meeting with Shirley to show them to her, but never made such arrangements. The calls did not necessarily come from Susan's killer and may have been from someone harassing Shirley after reading about Susan's murder in the local newspapers, but police still investigated them. These phone calls were a major part of a renewed effort to solve the long cold case in 2017. The tapes of the calls were restored, and a language expert from Rice University was consulted about the voice of the unknown man. Part of one of the calls was also released to the public in early 2018 in hopes that someone would recognize the voice. At this time, investigators had a piece of evidence that the technology available in 1983 had been unable to properly utilize: a male DNA profile found in a sample on the jumpsuit Susan had been strangled with. Investigators began looking at another known killer as a potential suspect in Susan's case: Anthony Allen Shore, the so-called tourniquet killer, who sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature at least 4 victims between 1986 and 1995. Because of the similarity between his crimes and Susan's murder, the Texas Rangers investigated the possibility that he had killed Susan. However, DNA excluded him as a suspect just prior to his execution in January of 2018. Without any other identified suspect to compare the crime scene DNA to and no matches to it in criminal databases, authorities turned to genetic genealogy as a possible means of identifying Susan's killer. Working with the FBI, they found a distant relative of the killer after months of research using public genealogy databases. This relative had been just a child at the time of Susan's death and had no relationship with the killer. They cooperated fully with the investigation and helped narrow down its focus even further until they finally identified their suspect, Arthur Raymond Davis. Davis was a 35-year-old Vietnam veteran working as a fishing boat in 1983. He bears a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the man who asked Susan to dance at the saloon. Investigators presented the evidence they collected to the Harris County District Attorney's Office and believed that it was strong enough to indict Davis in the case. Unfortunately, Davis cannot be charged in the case. He died in a single-vehicle accident on NASA Road 1, less than a mile away from where the body was found, in January of 1984, 4 months after her murder. While Susan's family agrees with law enforcement's belief that the case is solved, despite the lack of any trial or conviction, they still hope that the public can help them. They are hoping that individuals who knew Davis will come forward and help them understand the motive in the murder. Given Davis's resemblance to the composite sketch of the man who asked Susan to dance the last night she was alive, it is easy to imagine that he followed her out of the club and attacked her because she rejected him. However, this is just a theory, and while the resemblance between Davis and the sketch is striking upon comparison, there is still no proof that it was Davis in the saloon that night. Men with mustaches wearing cowboy hats are certainly not unusual in Texas. The Eeds family hopes that an old friend of Davis may be able to identify a link between him and Susan, or tell them about his state of mind in August of 1983, to help them try to understand why the crime was committed now that they know who perpetrated it. On June 26, 2020, Susan's family and the investigators who worked on her case gathered at the Forest Park East Cemetery to hold a service for Susan at her gravesite now that they finally have some measure of peace with her case being solved. One by one, each person in attendance placed a rose on Susan's grave. Late in the evening of January 27, 2002, 29-year-old Jim Springer Jr. called home to his wife Jenny from the AMF Broadway Bowl on South Broadway in Littleton, Colorado, where he was the new assistant manager. Jim had been born in Connecticut and raised in Utah. He had been given several options of locations to work at for AMF. He had been offered positions in New York and in Salt Lake City, but because of the recent attacks in the former city and the upcoming Olympic Games being held in the latter, he did not believe that they would be safe places for him, Jenny, and their 2 small children to live. Therefore, he moved the family to Colorado so he could accept the position in Littleton. He had begun his new position there less than 2 months earlier, on December 3, 2001. Jim told Jenny that he had finished closing up the bowling alley for the night. He was waiting for Erin's ride to arrive, and he would be giving Bobby a ride before coming home. Erin was 26-year-old Erin Gola. She was a graduate of Bear Creek High School and the mother of 2 young children. She worked as a snack bar manager at the bowling alley. Bobby was 23-year-old Bobby Zias. He was an employee at the AMF bowling alley in Highlands Ranch, but spent a lot of time at Broadway Bowl to be with friends he had there. He had loved bowling since he was a child and had bowled multiple perfect games. He had been going through a difficult time recently following the end of a long-term relationship, but was looking forward to starting his new job with the Colorado Department of Transportation and considering going to school to get a degree in accounting. Aaron had called a friend to get a ride home after closing. At 11:50 that night, Aaron's ride was waiting for her outside of the bowling alley when she saw a bald man wearing a trench coat exiting the building. When Aaron did not come outside, her friend decided to go into the bowling alley to see what was causing the delay. Inside, she found Jim, Aaron, and Bobby. They had all been shot and killed. The murders had occurred during a robbery. The safe had been opened and emptied. The bowling alley had been robbed once weeks earlier, but no one had been killed during that crime. Aaron's friend was able to help develop a sketch of the man she had seen leaving the bowling alley. The sketch was distributed, but no one came forward identifying the man in the sketch. Several months after the murders, Aaron's name came up in relation to different crimes. She was found to have connections to a methamphetamine ring that was the subject of a grand jury investigation. Her exact connection to the individuals involved was never fully established because she could not be interviewed as a part of the investigation. These connections could of course be purely coincidental and have nothing to do with the murders. Over the years, hundreds of tips were called in to the police, but very little progress was made in the case despite ongoing media attention. In 2015, Jim, Aaron, and Bobby were each individually featured in a set of playing cards distributed in Colorado prisons by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Each card in the decks features the victim of a cold case along with information about their case. The playing card program was started in hopes that the cases would reach inmates who may have knowledge of who committed the crimes and be willing to cooperate. Metro Denver Crime Stoppers is offering a reward of up to $2,000 in the case, which remains unsolved. Galen Rose was the proud mother of 4 daughters: Kiana Davis, 11, Kiara Phillips, 9, Carrie L. McDonald, 7, and Kiana Welsh, 5. The family lived in the small town of Florida, Indiana. Galen had relocated the family to Flora from Missouri after her father, Tracy, moved there for work. They lived with Tracy for several months while they got settled and then moved into an apartment a few blocks away on East Columbia Street. The apartment was in a house that had been converted into 2 separate units. Kiana loved adventure, and Carrie was feisty and loved to make others smile. Kiani and Kiara were both a little more quiet. All 4 of the sisters were members of the Lafayette Diamonds cheerleading squad. They spent November 19, 2016 in South Bend, Indiana for a cheer competition, and the following day, Kiana, who had hopes of one day being a star player in high school, had a basketball game. In the early morning hours of that Monday, November 21, 2016, a fire broke out in the family's apartment. The unit had no working smoke detectors to alert them of the danger, but Galen was awoken by the smoke. She fought desperately to get into her daughter's bedrooms but was pushed back by thick black smoke. Injured, she went outside to try to find another way to get to the girls, who were trapped in their rooms by flames and screaming for help. Upon his arrival at the scene, Carroll County Sheriff's Deputy, Drew Yoder, entered the burning structure to try to save the girls. Because Flora was such a small community, he was familiar with the family. He knew Galen from the gas station where she worked. She would always smile, ask about his day, and tell him to be safe as he left. He often saw the girls outside their home dancing and playing together, and they would always stop what they were doing to wave to him as he passed. During his 3rd attempt to enter the burning home to rescue the girls, Deputy Yoder was seriously injured. He was pulled from the building by Florida Police Officer Josh Dissinger, who was also injured in the process. Galen was outside screaming for her girls, unable to find a way to help them. For a while, the girls could be heard screaming back to her, but eventually all 4 girls stopped screaming. All 4 of the sisters died of asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation. Galen was airlifted to a hospital in Indianapolis, where she remained for several days receiving treatment for her injuries. Deputy Yoder was taken to a burn unit in Fort Wayne, and Officer Dissinger was treated at a hospital in Lafayette. The home was severely damaged by the fire, and officials were initially unable to determine the cause of it. They speculated that it may have been an electrical fire that started behind the refrigerator, but a further would be needed. On January 28, 2017, the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, which has jurisdiction over the Indiana State Fire Marshal, announced that the fire had been set intentionally. The fire was ruled an arson because accelerant was found in several areas inside the home. A 2018 peer review by the Indianapolis Fire Department also confirmed the determination. An arsonist would have had access to the home because the back door could not be locked. Galen had reported the problem to her landlord 2 weeks before the fire, but it had not been fixed. This was one of many major issues with the residents that were outlined in a lawsuit filed by Galen in 2018 against her landlords and their holding company. The main premise of the suit is that by not installing functioning smoke detectors, as required by Indiana state law, the landlords contributed to the girls' deaths. They did not start the fire, but prevented the girls from waking up in time to escape the burning home before the fire spread, trapping them inside. The lawsuit also alleges that the landlords failed to provide a habitable residence, leaving the back door and several dangerous electrical outlets unrepaired and not completing work on the leaking kitchen ceiling. The lawsuit is ongoing. The arson determination was not without controversy. However, a local private investigator who consulted on the fire disagreed with the findings, and state arson investigator, Dennis Randall, who had been working on the case, subsequently resigned in June of 2017. His son, Adam Randall, resigned as the fire chief in Flora 5 months later. With so much instability in the investigation, the local NAACP chapter has raised concerns that the entire investigation may have been bungled. The entire town of Florida has rallied behind Galen and the memory of her girls. Every church in the greater Florida area, as well as several local businesses, contributed to supporting Galen with meals and other material concerns after the fire. 2 local funeral homes joined together to provide a memorial service for the girls. The small community has raised more than $20,000 for a reward in the case, in part through creating and selling a cookbook dedicated to the 4 sisters known as Flora's 4 Angels. On the 2nd anniversary of the fire, investigators claimed that they had solid persons of interest in the case, but no arrests have ever been made, and whoever set the fire that took the lives of the 4 sisters has not yet been brought to justice. Galen Rose and her father, Tracy, have since left Flora, moving to California, where Galen is in therapy to try to cope with her unimaginable loss. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.